to make mention of this room. I've been in here before. I interviewed you for HEEB several years ago. It looks like there are even more books in here, if that was at all possible, than there were 5 years ago.
Did you ever play Tetris? I sometimes feel I have this really large Tetris field that's like this room, and eventually, like, I'll be Collier Brothers to death.
Yeah. But you can't. You know, you're in Manhattan. You're in New York City. You're only allotted one personal library, as far as I know.
Well, personally, I have like 2 spaces, and they're relatively large.
Yeah.
So, nevertheless, it sure do fill up.
I'm in the process of moving right now. I'm actually moving tomorrow. I don't want to even attempt to compare my book collection with yours, but this is always the inner, the debate that I have every single time I move are the books.
Yeah, like it's why I can never move. It's not allowed. But in fact, like Francoise and I were talking about how when you die, you tend to get a tombstone. But I think what we need is like a few really large dumpsters.
Yeah.
So they passed away, and this is what they accomplished. They gathered all this shit.
They made some of it.
Made some and accumulated others, and it's going to be really hard to get people to even want any of it because it's all books instead of electronic nuggets of information.
Yeah, although I saw something on online recently about there's several groups out there right now attempting to salvage all of that digital information because a lot of the stuff that's being stored right now is a much shorter shelf life than any of us had thought.
Yeah, that makes sense because if something goes wrong, it's all gone. If a piece of paper gets ketchup on it, or whatever, even gets burned, some of the book might remain. That's likely true, and you do probably have to like change your source material every few years because, like, I think I have documents written in WordPerfect that I may never see again or something.
Are you? I might have asked you this question last time too, but this is the other problem that I have is I don't. I mean, I'm not an artist. So I'm not necessarily looking to the books for inspiration for source material, but I don't find myself going back to them as often as I think I would like to, or I should, or at least given the fact that I'm in a small Queens apartment and they're right there all the time, I should be rereading these things.
Well, it depends which ones. I mean, I have books that I've never gone back to. They're like trophies of the times that I went through them. There's others that I'll pick up again when another set of interests brings me back somewhere. But then there's a lot of books I have that are actually what one used to go to research libraries for. Like certainly in this area, in the universe of comics and art, I find that there's different ways of thinking about it that just make me always have to look up sometimes the same book. Like 1 month after I think, okay, I got everything I need, that's gone. Then some other project comes up and I don't have like a totally retentive memory. And when you get really down to very refined nuggets of things you're looking for, it's not going to be online.
Yeah. What do you I mean, I know this is a broad question, but what are you generally looking for? Are you looking for...
Well, like when I did this Wordless thing, right? All of a sudden, not only am I trying to find whatever I've gathered over the years because it was a trope of something I was interested in, but now I had to reanalyze them, find references to them in other books, find artists that influenced them or were influenced by them, find things that preceded them by several hundred years, like in the way of like medieval woodblock prints and things like that. And turns out my interests have been relatively consistent. It's about words and pictures and how they intertwine, and very often from the lower end rather than the higher end of the cultural spectrum. And so I've gathered all this stuff, and there's a certain point where, like, if you're looking it up online, it's great for certain things, and then you hit a wall. They just don't have that more rarefied bits of stuff available. So I find myself using... There's certain books that I've worn to shreds. There's other things that are a problem because I have too many books between the two spaces that we have, and even some books now crowding Francoise out of her New Yorker office. They'll have to be packed up and brought to their new, God help us, home in Freedom Tower. Sad. But anyway, that's someplace I didn't intend to stray down. But I find that, like, very often I'm out there buying the same books a second or even a third time because after the second day of looking, I'm realizing that, well, my time isn't like as precious as a Morgan Stanley investment banker or something, but like after the second or third day, if a book is $30 or $40, I'm just going to find it again. And certainly the internet's been very good at letting you find copies of old books.
I have to imagine that there must be a lot of things in here that aren't in New York libraries, right?
Probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, libraries for sure. They didn't really collect in this area at the time.
I was just thinking, as far as sort of going back and this cross section between words and pictures and pictorial storytelling. I interviewed Karen Green a while ago at her office at Columbia, and she hadn't realized this until I was sitting in her cubicle, and it's about half comics and then half medieval art. And so I made the sort of goofy, it's just, you came here to do this thing, I'm doing this thing, and then she sat me down and explained to me why those two things maybe aren't so
oh no, they're
apart.
very connected.
Yeah,
they really are. I mean, because a lot of the stuff that's printed in like medieval prints and stuff, those weren't like the high culture. The high culture was in the churches and in the palaces ultimately. And it's the kind of, anonymous monks sitting there in their cells illuminating the one copy of books before Gutenberg came around to change the game the way the internet has again. Or they're like just lower echelon worker ants doing their woodcut illuminations, Now here's a tangent worth taking.
Okay.
Because the stuff that I like, which wasn't considered necessarily the crowning jewel of artistic creation, reaching toward God and whatever, like that stuff. So there's this monk, and he's sitting in a cell, and he's doing this thing. But
sounds like a setup to a joke.
No. A rabbi and a monk walk in, and then there's like these two hookers who. No, let me start that again. So, reading in the Times maybe 15 years ago now, using those new technology, microscopes and X-ray machines to see if something's forged or to see previous layers of work. There's some article about one of these books of hours that was made, and they use the lens to go really, really, really far in a way that could never have been done before. So we're talking about a picture that's about 6 inches by 5 inches maybe, but it's got a castle in the background and there's some battle in the foreground and whatever.
There's a lot happening.
There's a lot happening, but it's not as impacted as say S. Clay Wilson, but it's a lot for such a small area. And then when you zoom in the castle is a little banner on top, and it can't be wider than like 1/8 of an inch or so. And on it, with a single hair brush, was written, "For God's eyes only." So it got to be seen because of new technology, but this guy was just sort of like,
it's like a Bible verse on a grain of sand.
Yeah, it was like just a little scrimshaw that this guy was making,
So you, this does actually lead us to the tour that you're on, and it seems like you've become the guy. You've become the guy to explain, to explain to everyone why, not just comics, why the graphic novel is hardly a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I guess so, and especially like I still haven't gotten over ranting about the phrase. It's not. I'll say it, but I have interior air quotes around it whenever I use it because I know people get some idea of something if they hear the phrase.
I had this exact conversation with an editor who I referred to something as a comic, and he said, because you use graphic novel, and I was like, well, but Art Spiegelman says. Yeah,
but I don't. Despite the rumors in some corners of the internet, I am not the Jew in charge of all comics media, as Ted Rall might have had.
That was like, if Art Spiegelman says it's okay to call it comics, then I think it's okay to call it comics.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it just seems like the funniest version of this that I heard was like seems like it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm doing a one-page thing for the Washington Post, and it's about the anniversary of some ship that was turned away from Cuba that was filled with refugees. And the editor's getting really jazzed about this, and he calls up and he's really excited. He says, "This is so great. We've never had a graphic novel in our pages before." And I started laughing. I said, "It's 1 page long."
Yeah.
He says, "Yeah, and we've never had one."
And you never will.
And I said, "Well, they tend to be longer, and if you think of these as graphic novels, there's a section right next door to yours that has graphic novels on a weekly basis in color, in the Washington Post.
Is it a problem of language? Is it semantics, or is it really just this idea that we have to give it some heft? They have problems, kind of take issue with that that we're almost insulting it by calling it comics.
Yeah, this is a little bit like when I was growing up. The proper phrase to refer to somebody who's black shifted from Negro to African American to Afro American to, or somewhere in there was colored. And these were not necessarily the pejorative words; they were just the word at the time. But there was a moment where the dignity of the people affected by the word was in collision with the fact that whatever word you used soon got to be used as a pejorative inside people's heads, right? So, like, I think at a certain point in that Archie Bunker universe, you would say, "Yes, he's an Afro-American," like with a sneer. So then people would so people would move to some other phrase, but the stain kept catching up.
Yeah.
So therefore, I thought this was a sucker's game, changing the name.
Yeah.
I thought just change the material, and then people encompass the new material under the word comics. And I still do that, because there was hefty work worth considering and reconsidering all through the history of comics while they were called comics. So it's not like ambition and artistic and literary heft, let's call it, only arrived with, I don't know where you want to start it, 80s, 70s, but it was present throughout. And in fact, one whole category of book I didn't mention is I've got lots of books of comics and pictures, and it's not even for reference. I just like looking at that stuff, and it was art that was made for reproduction, so I've got this museum here.
Yeah. So how long have you been collecting this material specifically for the tour?
Well, the tour is the culmination of having found this stuff in the 60s when I was a teenager. When Lynd Ward stuff was first reprinted, I'd wander around bookstores because I'm kind of geeky, and found one of these books, God's Man. And I was like, wow, I'd never seen anything like it, and I could feel a family resemblance to what I was aspiring toward. But I must have been mid-60s, 64, 65. I'd have to look at the copyright date to know when it first came my way. And at that point, I just sort of had a flag up, like, I want to see more of this stuff. So I'd look for it in bookstores, and even then, the Lynd Ward stuff was quite collectible, so it took a while. But I'd stumble across things that I'd never heard of, but I'd find it in the store, like Otto Nuckel's Destiny, if you ever saw that one. It's probably the most beautiful for me in terms of its graphic style of all of them. And then I found Masriel, and that was really rich. And then as I began traveling to Europe in the 70s, it was easier to find certain things. And then bit by bit, some of it would get reprinted here and there. So I managed, it's not a giant genre, but it has a few really key practitioners, and I was able to find their stuff. And it was important to me because it was a model of something I was aspiring to, which wasn't so much wordlessness as a kind of comics that didn't have to apologize for itself. In the sense that it was fine when I wanted to do stuff inspired by Tijuana Bibles. I didn't have to apologize for myself. It was just in the tradition. But when I wanted to do something that had like an emotional weight to it, there weren't too many models.
How was Lynd Ward's stuff regarded at that point? I mean, I know that he was really sort of influential around that time period. My understanding is that
that time period meaning the 30s.
Well, no, I mean even later, even closer when you came around, the 60s, the 50s.
Well, he was respected, but not. The woodcut novels were pretty much unknown. I got to meet him a little bit before he died. It was right before I did Prisoner on the Hell Planet. Like when I don't remember the year again, but
in late 70s.
No, that would have been in the 60s. Still. Okay. Well, maybe in the 70s. Let me think. Well, early 70s. But at that time, he was I was the youngest person in the room by about 3 generations. Like
this was an art showing?
It was an art show in Binghamton, New York, at a frame shop. And I just saw his name, and I went, I'm going there,
Were you anywhere in the vicinity of Binghamton?
Yeah, that's how I knew that it was happening. I was just like, at that point, let's see, this must have been 71 or 72, because I was just careening from having been in a rather insane commune that had exploded, and I just crawled out of New York City to like convalesce in my old college town. And then there's a weekly newspaper that says that this gallery is this little frame shop gallery is going to have Lynd Ward's work in it, and the artist would be present. Turns out he was friends of the people who had the frame shop, so they had the show. They were like his woodcut graphic art, not his woodcut novels, not his commercial illustration, but the woodcuts he made. And they were interesting, but like I was really interested in meeting him and talking to him about the woodcut novels specifically. And he was just astonished, A, that I was there at all, because like I said, I was way too young for this sort of thing, being whatever, like early 20s. And also knowing these books, because at that point they were more or less out of print. Even the one that I found in the 60s, it wasn't like the big deal it had been. Like when it first came out, it really was a big deal in 1930. And he was known, if anything, probably for his children's book illustrations and for his book illustrations for like these kind of heritage editions that would be higher class reprints of the classics with like there's a Frankenstein one of his that's very pricey still. But he did a lot. I don't remember. Jane Eyre, I think, was another one that he did. So he's more known for those.
Just illustrations.
Illustrations, sometimes in woodcut and sometimes in kind of litho-crayon technique, but he also did gouache painting and has several children's books that he's very highly regarded as a children's book illustrator. So it was more that than this particular thing.
But you mentioned it. He was surprised.
He was surprised and very friendly about it. You know, at some point, I ended up writing this in like the thing that catalyzed Wordless more recently. You know, like closer to the inception date, was that Library of America had decided now that graphic novels were really something that they would have their first picture volumes in the Library of America, and they chose.
This happened within the last couple of years.
2 years,
really?
3-4 years ago. Let's see, is one of them? Yeah, here. Could you hold my microphone? I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Like here's the Library of America books with. So here are the Library of America editions of all 6 of his woodcut
edited
novels.
by Art Spiegelman.
But edited is a little bit strong. Like they did the heavy lifting. I wrote the essay and had some kibitzing. They're really nice, and they're printed from the original woodcut, so they aren't like degenerate editions. And they handle it properly by printing it only on one side of a page. And they're within 98 to 100% of the original size, depending on the book.
I'm amazed that so this is what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books collected here. Still seems like a lot of text for these graphic.
No, where?
Oh, they're very thick volumes.
Oh, the thick volumes. They're printed on one side of a page, and there's an apparatus. Like there's like the thing I could never have done that the Library of America did was a really scrupulous chronology of his life. It functions like a biography in the form of a chronological timeline. Then there's the essay in the front, and a couple of his essays are there to fill it out. But it's pretty much his woodcut work for his narrative woodcut work in one place. So
and these are the first time that these have been reprinted in some time.
I think so. I mean, some of them may have come and gone in Dover. I don't know what happened when, but this is the first definitive gathering of these things. And some of the books have pretty much never existed in any kind of mass form. Like they're just things that he did. He had his own press for a while. In the height of the Depression, he had made money off of God's Man, which was really a success. And so he used that to found a left-wing press because he had a lot of writer friends. He did a picture biography of John Reed with one of the authors from the masses and his drawings as a young adult story of John Reed, for example.
I had read a story. I think there might even be a story the press release about the tour. But I guess getting back to the story of you meeting him, that I think you had attempted to talk comics with him. And
yes, that's exactly that's how we got to this particular loop, because in this thing I mentioned meeting him and asking him about, so what comics did you like when you were a kid? And he that was the first time he looked at me like, who let this kid in here? You know, he said, "Oh no, I never read comics. My father was a Protestant missionary, like a left wing preacher or whatever. I don't know the right words for this right now because I'm tired. But
progressive missionary.
He's a progressive Christian who'd work in the ghettos and deal with kids who had diseases and try to organize workers and things like that. And but he definitely had a religious disposition, and therefore would never let his kid read something like the Sunday Funnies. Sunday was the day to read the good book.
Yeah.
So basically what Lynd Ward was weaned on was not Steve Ditko or Harvey Kurtzman, depending on one's generational and other disposition. It was more like Doré's Bible illustrations. That's what he was really seeing.
Is there a direct lineage between this and I mean, so this is you said 20s, 30s. A lot of these things were. Is there a direct connection between these graphic stories and comics, as far as you can tell, or was it people discovering
I think
later?
for some people, it depends on which artist we're talking about. For Lynd Ward, definitely not. And when I pushed him further, I said, "But didn't you ever see any later?
Yeah.
Which ones did you like?" And he was going, "Well, I guess Prince Valiant was okay, the most like book illustration."
Yeah.
But there were other artists who, if not comics, they were cartoonists. Like this guy who did Destiny was definitely also a cartoonist in the humor and satire magazines of the 20s and 30s in Paris and in Germany. Franz Masriel was definitely had his roots in some kind of newspaper art also, as well as getting interested in woodcuts, primarily through something that was just beginning to happen, like a woodcut revival in Germany, which probably has something to do with Japanese woodcuts even, but also with the medieval German books. So there was that. But there also he was a political cartoonist in the papers, and some of these things have a lot of kind of, they ain't Tijuana Bibles, but they get hottish. It
is sort of fascinating, though, how quickly it seems to, at least sort of in public perception, have gone from I guess relatively high art to low art with the introduction of text to that.
Oh, well, that's core to core to my thesis, and it's like it started out as probably a lower art, in America, right? Like these comics were not considered like the turn of the century Yellow Kid and beyond. That was kind of the riffraff of art. It wasn't like.
But you've got Dickens and
illustrated
and
books.
I mean, those are perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, although when they were coming out, they were just popular culture. They weren't coming out as like, here's another tome from James Coetzee or whoever, or here's James Joyce's latest chapter. That wasn't stuff people were waiting on the docks for in the same way. It was part of the popular culture, and those things fed into each other, the cartoonists and illustrators and back and forth. But this has a lot to do with the rise of literacy and a change in perception of where comics sat in the culture.
Yeah, but I guess it is interesting that concurrent to that, the introduction of text is almost what makes it a lower art, is the juxtaposition between the two, right?
You got to come, even though it's not going to be in New York. But like, I got like exhibit A, B, and C that really shows something kind of electrifying in the way this kind of
you've cracked the code.
Shift. Yeah, I think I found like the specific things that turned perception.
Well, we've got newspaper comics. It sort of makes sense why that's looked at as being a little bit lower. I mean, these are like very. These are disposable products and during the time period, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting. This is not exactly on this topic, but it's right next door, which is in Europe, especially in France. This was never as big a gulf.
Yeah.
Like Picasso worked for a humor magazine called The Four Cats. Toulouse-Lautrec was working not only doing signage for whorehouses basically, but making things where you'd see the connection, and yet he was still part of the modernist current. Juan Gris was a second generation cubist who also was doing cartoons for La Sierra Burr and other cartoon magazines at the beginning of the century. Kupka, a lot of people who are respected as painters were also working mostly as single panel cartoonists, but often with the aim of getting a laugh, not political cartoons per se. And there wasn't that kind of cordon sanitaire between one thing and the other.
Yeah.
You know, so America, it's specific, and you know, like by the time you get to the 20s and 30s, you've got people like George Gross, and he's really just like, they're coming at it as artists, but they're also making stuff that any cartoonist will recognize as kin.
You do speak a little bit about Wortham in the piece, but I guess that's several decades later, so I don't know if that how much of a shift in public perception.
Well, it's a shift in the perception of somebody who has shifted perceptions, because Wortham was brought up with that high German tradition. He was educated in Germany as a young man, and he must have been born in, I wish I had that at my fingertips, but I've got the reference books I haven't thrown away that could tell me.
That is something you can find in Wikipedia.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. But, he must have been probably in his 50s by then.
Yeah.
Right? So he was growing up with the high art when it was being infected by popular culture in Germany, but it was still, there was a very clear high-low distinction, and he bought into it. So
is this, and this is still, I mean, I guess what fascinates me is that, after all these years and 25 plus years since Mouse, this is still a topic that really interests you, is public perception of high art, low art.
Well, because it's still affecting things. Now it's like everybody just wants to climb onto the low art bandwagon and get as far away from high art as possible. Now that it's seen as an extension of the stock market more than anything else.
Obviously.
Well, it shaped me. It shaped me, and it's still going on. Like, I'm seeing the way comics are entering into the culture, and very interested in seeing that happen. But there's still a kind of membrane that is resistant to certain things, and includes that thing that started breaking down probably in the early 60s of the prohibition against putting words and pictures together. Before that, you just have a piece of a newspaper pasted onto a cubist collage or something. But it's in the 60s that you really began to have people like mixing language and pictures together one way or another, even in the lame Lichtenstein manner.
I was going to ask you, nobody who's actually involved in comics seems to be a big proponent of what he did.
No, there are more interesting pop artists, including when Warhol did his Dick Tracy. That still seemed pretty interesting to me. It's just like, I always found the Lichtenstein thing vaguely condescending and insulting. You know, it was like,
look at this silly thing that we're putting on the wall.
Yeah, well, it was worse than that. I'll take a soundbite from one of the comics lectures that I give when it's not this talk.
Sure.
But basically, Lichtenstein and the pop artists in general were trying to find a way out of the cul-de-sac of the 1950s abstract expressionist moment, because people like to draw things. They like to draw. They don't start. Well, maybe they do start by making a crayon scrawl or a shit scrawl if they're babies on a wall.
They think they're doing something.
They're doing something, but like, there is an impulse to want to record something with your hand, based on seeing something or having an idea, picture of something.
There's a reward in the acknowledgement that what you have drawn has an analog in the real world when mom comes along and sees that it's a dog. Yeah,
you get rewarded for that. And when I've seen like parents with their little kids in front of a Picasso or whatever, and they'll say, "Can you see the cow?" It's like, "Oh yeah, there's a cow."
Yeah. It's like a Where's Waldo.
Yeah, so it's like, it's a something as well as a pun between being just subdividing a rectangle of canvas so that it does
That's hard
activates.
to explain to a 3-year-old. It's abstract impressionism. Cows are a lot easier. Look at the funny cow.
So there's that aspect to it. But if you were a serious artist in the late 50s and you wanted to do something representational, you were kind of laughed out of the club. Just go join Lynd Ward and the other louts who are illustrators. A low thing to be. And pop art was trying to find a way around that issue, and it did it by saying, no, we're not drawing anything. We're just making pictures of something.
Yeah.
So the Lichtenstein stuff, it's not a woman. It's a drawing about the fact that somebody drew a woman with tears in her eyes. And then what it was specifically was to like make some point about high-low, in which, these vulgarians, instead of a mark like George Gross's or Rembrandt's marks. Well, let's leave George Gross out of it. He's a problem. But let's say Rembrandt's marks. These are like industrial, soulless marks, these thick brush lines. And instead of painterly skin that you'd love to touch, like the kind that Rubens painted, these are just red dots. So it was a way of somehow talking about the soullessness of commercial culture and the inability of the masses to understand an abstraction, even though look how well my rectangle is composed.
Yeah.
Lichtenstein might say, even though they're often very close to the Kirby's he swiped. But be that as it may. But be that as it may, like it was changing the scale, changing the context, and then being able to say this isn't what it comes from. It's been transformed the same way that urinal that Duchamp once put up on a wall got transformed. And so I says, in response, he did no more for comics than Warhol did for soup. It's just that. On the other hand, there were really interesting pop artists like the Chicago School that were giving comics their due and trying to move toward the distortions that a Chester Gould could bring to comics, for example.
So we before we fired up the
The
microphone, you were doing another interview, and I know that you've got sort of a battery tonight as you're about to head out on this tour. And I can imagine it gets a little tired. You get a little tired, certainly speaking of the same things over and over again. But you do, you are very interested in I guess comics as presentation. As far as mixing this sort of solitary thing to create and to consume into this live event. And this is something that I'm seeing. I want to say more and more as they get more and more popular. I mean, Bob Skoriak has the carousel, which is fantastic, and it's fascinating to watch. One of my favorite things ever that I've seen was I saw one of Ben Ketcher's musical. I don't even know if he has a word for what he makes, but it's fascinating to see different artists try to interpret this into a stage presentation.
Well, part of it is, it's very lonely work sitting in the studio all the time. So if you get to, I'm excited. I get to do this thing that I should have done in my 20s, which is travel with a band and never did. So here, there's that. But also for me, it really grew out of lecturing and wanting to see if I could give shape to a lecture and make it into an actual thing.
Something sort of independent of comics.
Not independent of, but I've lectured on comics for 25 years. I don't know how long, forever, in universities and in classes and so on. And I've gotten that down fairly well, and it allows me to riff and improvise. And now, thanks to PowerPoint presenter tools, I don't have to go in order, so I can choose a slide. It reminds me of something. I can find it from later in the presentation and bring it out. And this is kind of sync event magic. So it always began to feel somewhat performative over the years. Over the years, it became somewhat performative. But I would say that this was like wanting to up the ante and make something that felt like, it's a performance. It just doesn't follow all the rules of what you'd associate with that.
What are the I mean, obviously the music is, I think, the big distinction.
Well, no, with performance you'd expect music.
I thought you meant as far as going to see comics.
No, I would just say that as a performance, it has other aspects that include. There's a division that I don't quite recognize. For example, that Francoise ran up against to a stone wall when she started doing her tune books. If something is entertaining, it's not supposed to be educational, and if it's educational, it's not supposed to be entertaining. Since Francoise very specifically was starting tune books to have leveled readers, to nurse kids into that specific moment where they've decoded the alphabet, now they have to learn to read. And so she did level 1, level 2, level 3, lexiled so that it would be passed by Bank Street Books or something, and then finding that was a problem. If she just presented these as picture books, they'd be embraced as, look, Granny's going to get the kid something the kid will enjoy.
It's such a silly thing because we all learn to reading comics, right?
Yes.
I mean, it makes, she's doing it in a very deliberate way.
She's doing it in a very deliberate way. But the other thing she was doing is trying to not do it the way easy readers are probably the lowest form of literature, way lower, if we're going to keep high and low, than anything comics ever did, even at their most lurid, because they're made by people who are kind of sleepwalking through it. It's like, here's your word list, here's a kid who's out of high school who barely learned to control a pen, and here's somebody in the office who can rewrite Sleeping Beauty with this word list without
like a
thinking
fridge
about
magnet
it.
Sort of puzzle.
Yeah, and it's not done with any energy or interest, because the higher end of this is the picture book, the glorious Maurice Sendak stuff, you know, because there it's you can feel it. Oh, it's not trying to be educational, although sometimes it actually is. Very much so.
It's reading. It's educational.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
So there's that. But even within that world of reading, there's like, this is the stuff you read because it's fun to sit down with the kid and have him on your lap. This is the one where the kid's supposed to be learning to read, the very earliest.
This is the one the kid doesn't want to read.
You know, it's right. Here's the castor oil.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the goal here, and part of the economic reason is just easy readers are so specific that you grow out of them, in quotes, after about 4 months, and you go to the next level of reader. And Francoise's books were such that, okay, you can read this if you're at this stage of development, you can read the other one at another stage of development, but the one you read first you're still going to want to have. It's not like she invented that, like some of the best Dr. Seuss stuff was done the same way. You know, like Go Dog Go is entertaining to me when I was reading it to my kids, as well as for the kid who likes the fact that it only has like 25 words in it or something.
And nobody has those lifelong fond memories for the easy reader books.
No, you can't. They were done like just as like, okay, let's get this thing over with. You've got to learn it so you can read books first with pictures, and then let's get rid of those training wheels and get you reading that gray page after gray page of type. But I never saw that distinction as that meaningful. So the fact is that I think that this is a kind of delirious presentation, but it also ends up having you chew on a lot of things afterwards that are beyond the norms of like, oh God, this was as escapist as going to some comedy club or whatever, you know.
So do you
that
know?
was a
are
bad
you
example.
well, as far as the feedback that you get after the show, when people come out and say, I was surprised that it was this. Is more, is it more people surprised that they learned something? Is it more people surprised that they were generally entertained?
I'm not sure, but I know they got like, I mean, I ain't bragging. I'm just reporting. It got standing ovations in almost every place it was in. So they were just like into it. Whatever it was, they were into it. And you know, everybody likes getting something that's not like what they had before if they're not scared of it. You know, if it's not like, this isn't like anything I would go to, I'm not going to go. But once it's actually happening, if it's like on some level moving and funny and got things you never thought about before, that's a good thing.
How clearly delineated are the different segments? I mean, is this is the lecture period?
No, it keeps weaving back and forth. Because part of it was to create a feeling of disorientation. So it moves back and forth between.
Why are you trying to disorient people?
Because that way people will be able to enter more into the material.
Yeah.
They don't keep their preconceptions in place.
To sort of almost take them out of the fact that they're sitting there and.
Well, they're sitting there. They're listening to a live performance created specifically around these pieces. Because even though I mentioned that, like, Philip comes at this from being especially interested in silent film music. Yeah. Did I tell you that, or was that to the guy?
We actually haven't spoken about Philip yet. So okay. He's the band leader.
You're blurring together with the thing I was talking about 5 minutes before you set up your mic. So he's a composer and a saxophonist and a band leader. And one of the things that he's really focused on, among just liking to perform, is silent film music, like writing new scores for old films. He loves silent movies. And that's how I got to be aware of his stuff, actually.
Is it one of these sort of, you go to Bryant Park and see...
Yeah, exactly. I was in Prospect Park with my kids when they were real young, and I thought every young child should see Lon Chaney's The Unknown. If you know the plot, you'll realize that I'm lucky I wasn't dragged off by social workers and the kids separated from me. But he was doing the sound. I didn't know. I just knew there'd be some accompaniment. Yeah. I really loved what was done there. And so we ended up meeting and working on something that we never brought to fruition called Drawn to Death, a 3-panel opera, which was another kind of hybrid, but done before projections were as easy to do as they are in the 21st century. and now he's getting his doctorate in silent film music, and he's done a lot of these things. And this was much harder because it has to be, as he says, trapped much more finely than you have to do in a silent film score.
What is he scoring exactly?
Well,
what is he? I mean, he's playing along to the readings.
Well, there's readings, and then there's a certain point where I shut up finally, so that you can get a wordless book, or at least some of it, before I come back on and start yakking again. So when that's happening, he's scoring to the QuickTime that we made, and had to sometimes alter a bit, or sometimes he had to write towards something he didn't expect he was going to have to do, but managed it that way. But it's kind of like the goal with that part of it was to do something that wasn't an animatic exactly, but that would let you see the stuff in time, because the whole glory of these books ultimately is you go at your own pace, and when you're ready you turn the page, you go back if you didn't get something. Here I have to make sure you get it so we can keep moving forward, and the music has a part in that as well.
And much the same way that you couldn't say colorize a film, you're not really keeping true to the source material if you're animating it versus keeping it
so
as
it was a complicated move, and I just figured it was like an accelerated first exposure. So I have the caveats.
Assuming that most of these people in the audience are seeing this for the first time.
Yeah, and if they've seen it before, then it's like a specific reading of it, and then it becomes the pleasures that can offer. You know what I mean? There's something about revisiting something, having it done in a group and whatever.
Like going to see the movie in Prospect Park.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's something about this that allows you to get the narrative aspect faster than would happen if you were doing it on your own, because there's ways you can kind of take a detail in a picture and make sure people have seen it rather than have to go back and find it, let's say.
Well, I mean, this is sort of, again, this is the interesting thing is I would think on some very basic level that if you're looking at a comics page and you've got to deal with the order of the panels, and you've got images and words, which on a very basic level, it almost seemed like these two conflicting things that you've got to use different sides of your brain to interpret. But it's harder.
This is harder and easier at the same time, because they're mostly, except for I do show some of the work that's multi-panel, that's part of the comics tradition, that's silent as well. Some of my own, in fact, as well. But these are at least that much easier because they're boxes. Sometimes all the same size, sometimes shifting depending on the scene, depending on the artist and which way they were working. But it's also harder because, when you're doing stuff in pantomime, it gets really hard. If you've ever tried to play a real kind of Olympic level version of charades, it gets hard unless you're doing sounds like, contort, and try to get somebody to know what you're thinking. Here, you've got to get certain aspects of the picture that have narrative qualities in order to keep moving through the story without getting lost. And I wanted to make it, when I talked about getting people disoriented, part of it is, it's okay to get lost. I'll catch you up. Just go with it, because sometimes the music is really kind of rather rich and pulls you along somewhere. Although he's very aware of what's happening each frame that we're showing, like Philip's somebody I could identify with, because I also, as you know from having seen my stuff over a number of years, I tend to be sort of a stylistic switch hitter. Each project has its own way it should look. So we're going through a lot of different eras of music and different kind. It's not one sauce fits all.
Yeah. How closely did you work with him as far as composing specific pieces? Pretty
close. Man, if it wasn't for Skype, I don't know how we would have done this, because he's half a planet away.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny, sort of knowing what I know about you, that it is the technology that's made all of this possible.
Absolutely. When I tried working with Philip the first time, it had to do with projections and stuff as well. But the first time I tried to do something was before I met Philip. It was also on Drawn to Death, before I started working with him. And the first performance of any kind had to be done with the most expensive projector, high lumen projector possible, that had a computer technician who had to translate everything into algorithms and didn't understand what I was asking of him. It was before you could do this on a laptop, basically. And within 8 minutes of the performance, the machine just had a plume of smoke coming out of it, and it died. So we just weren't able to really do it at Harvard.
When man could beat self-defeat machine.
Yeah, exactly. So it moved fast, but at that time it was really not an easy thing to manifest. And actually that grew out of what led to ultimately even this event, you mentioned the Ben Catcher stuff. It grew out of me being invited to do a libretto for a group called Bang on a Can. And they wanted just the libretto. I thought they just wanted sets. When I finally understood what they wanted, I said, well, can I make drawings? I said, well, sure. And then all of a sudden I was much more interested in the graphic elements than in figuring out the libretto, because I had to go to operas, because this was a vest pocket avant-garde opera, and I went to operas because that was never a category for me. I mean, I know there's such a thing as high art, but I didn't go there readily, you know. And so when I sat in the opera, I was going, this is so cool at the New York City Opera that have the super titles literally above, going by on top of the stage. When you put those in balloons and you got something, you know.
Well, that's funny, and this will bring us around to I think what I guess is a sort of a logical last question. But again, we're talking about how technology sort of made all this possible, and when you really think about it, when you sort of remove the live element, when you remove the audience, people sitting there watching it, what you've got in this, what you've got in, you know, the sense. Ben's live performances, or what Arsa Koryak is doing, you've got a live, I hate to use this term, it's almost as offensive as graphic novel, but you've got a live motion comic, which is this sort of, I know,
even worse.
Yeah,
it's literally shuttered.
Yeah, but I think, I don't know, I think it just is something that's been done really poorly. It's something that people have trying to sort of force these different things together, but does it make sense that at some point down the road, given how people are consuming comics now, given how popular comics are now, that there might be a magic bullet, there might be a way to make these things live in harmony?
Well, harmony is exactly what it's living in on stage with this stuff, I guess, or dissonance. But I don't know. I mean, I think these are all reactions to the fact that we're living on screen more and more and more, and things that yank you out of that, whether it be a book where you can actually concentrate on something, or communing with other people, even though you can watch almost anything by torrenting it. People still are going to the movies when they can afford it, you know? And it's partially just like being in a world with other people. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to get out of the studio and hang with other people and talk to other people, as well as just like having to write emails and then go back to consuming things on a screen. It's part of the reaction against where the technology is dragging us, you know? So that's part of it. And part of it with the comics thing is like one more way that can happen, I suppose, like things that are analogous to comics happening in performance is part of this. I got interested in what would happen when you in the Drawn to Death project, when you're mixing live people with comics tropes. Or I did it. Did you see that? At least there was a video of it at the Jewish Museum's incarnation of the comics exhibit. There was something of the thing I did with Polobolus.
I haven't.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
that was all taking a lot of the ideas I couldn't realize when working on Drawn to Death 10 years later, but when Polobolus asked me to work with them, that became interesting, and it worked just fine, having people move from panel to panel literally, with balloons above their head, with drawings interacting with people, in a more high-tech manner, but more low-tech than having whatever it was, Gene Kelly dance with Tom and Jerry or something. But nevertheless, there was different dialogue between things that are usually still and things that were moving like dancers.
But I guess again, that's getting into sort of the conceptual. This is a thing we could do. This is a thing in a museum versus this is a thing that we're making a lot of for a lot of people to.
Well, you're talking about what, comics on your phone?
Yeah, or again, this like weird thing that is motion comics, or of taking people through a comic in the way that you are in the live setting.
Yeah, well, the stuff that takes you back to the screen and moves, I'm just confused by it. I know people are beginning to work with it in interesting ways, probably, and also in some dreadful ways from what I've seen. But it is true that that's going to be happening more and more.
Yeah.
Right now, I think the way we started the conversation, talking about how anything you've got that's digital is going to disappear very soon. I think of this stuff as more fragile and ephemeral than newsprint. The stuff they're working in is not those technologies. The code that allows you to make that particular hybrid event on a screen is going to be just Aramaic in a few weeks. So there's something nice and stable about the paper comics. I'm just beginning to see it happen now. What becomes an issue is like, well, if you can add sound effects, you can have the whole thing be spoken. You don't need any balloons. And if you can have things move, they have this. It's called animated cartoons.
Exactly,
And as soon as you move back toward that other zone, it's complicated to negotiate where it's really appropriate to make something that uses language that I recognize as comics language. And for me, you know, I'm just so interested in what happens when you put lots of boxes together. It's why it took me a little bit of stretch to like learn what these woodcut novels were really doing, for example, because I like seeing 8 boxes at once.
Yeah. You know, maybe ultimately the downfall, though, is these very solid distinctions that we have between these mediums. I mean, there's no reason to...
Yes, I mean, that's
not
true.
dip your toes in as many as possible. Whatever's insofar as they're actually suitable for what you
exactly.
want to make.
Like you find what you need to be able to get made, what you want to have made. And I got really interested in Drawn to Death and what happened between 3D and 2D stuff. Here, I'm really interested in something that grew out of the lectures, which is communicative. And like, I got to say, a lot of what I've been trying, even in the comics, is like, I never was that excited about becoming like a gallery artist. I was afraid of even going there when I found my more arcane underground comics. If I could find a gallery, it might fit better in that world, but I didn't want to be in that world. I wanted to be making mass-produced objects, even if it was small mass. And now, like, okay, those distinctions are breaking down. This is a good thing. And I'm still, though, interested in the aspect of actually communicating something. And when I talk to some of the older painters and avant-garde filmmakers that I know, the word communication is a dirty word.
Yeah. Communicating in this sense being communicating to as many people as possible.
Well, and also very specifically, like when I don't know if it still exists, there used to be a magazine called Communication Arts, and it was a Mad Men advertising magazine. So communicating was really like the propaganda arts, you know, so like that was the opposite of what they meant. Now I just want to make sure that like what I mean is something that I can communicate to somebody else and they can understand it, feel it, think it. And so this is just more an extension of that than of using this as an expression unto itself.
That is the silly thing, and I think in a lot of cases the downfall of high art are things that are made to not be understood by the masses. You know, things to in a lot of cases just be made to be understood by the intellectuals.
Yeah, and I think that Chris Ware said it well when we were talking once. He said, like, at a certain point, like when he was in art school at the Chicago Art Institute, he thought art was a historical term, and it referred to stuff that was done way before he was of age. Like, there was something called art, but it stopped. Now there's this other thing.
They don't make art anymore.
Yeah, now they do something that's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Something took over the word and inhabits it, but it's a whole other thing, and I don't even know if it has to do with being intellectual or whatever. It has to do with money and status, and maybe, and there are probably real artists struggling around somewhere, and some of them may hit it somehow. But it's not what I associate with what I see when I wander around a lot of galleries.
There you have it, Art Spiegelman, legendary cartoonist. Always really, really excited to talk to Art, and you know, not just because he's incredibly smart and has a lot of super interesting things to say about comics and culture and all these other things, but I'm just always really excited to go visit his space. So we talked about this at the top of the conversation a little bit, but he's got this office that's basically it's pretty much a private library. I interviewed him maybe 3 or 4 years ago for HEEB Magazine in that same space. I was pretty impressed then, and he only seems to have more books now. And as you know, as you mentioned during the conversation, he's running out of space there and elsewhere. Actually, but the last time I saw Art was I think about 2 years ago. I randomly ran into him on the streets of Cologne, Germany, and he invited me to a talk that he was giving. Easily one of the most surreal experiences I've ever had in my life, because you know, not only was this American cartoonist up there, you know, giving a talk about a Holocaust comic that he had been made very famous for. But so this was a few years after the big kerfuffle around the Muhammad cartoons, and Amedinijad had started a contest basically for the best Holocaust and cartoons, and Art had entered that contest. So just super surreal to watch him in front of this crowd of German art enthusiasts laughing at Art's admittedly very funny Holocaust now cartoons. But that's the sort of intrigue and excitement that you get when you go see an Art Spiegelman live show. So he's touring around the country right now for this Wordless event that he has. That's actually I think probably the only reason why he agreed to do this dinky little podcast. But you know what, I absolutely I will take it. So you should definitely go check that out. It's a very interesting conversation about comics and right brain and left brain and history of these wordless novels, these woodcuts that have been around for years and years, and how that intersects with comics. I know we talked about this a little bit during the conversation, but figure I should give it a little plug if you do have the chance to go see it. The part that I find super fascinating is this idea of taking, like they do, like you'll go. I assume they have this in a lot of major cities, but they have it here in New York. You'll go to like Bryant Park and you'll go see a silent film, and they'll do like a live score, and it really kind of impacts your relationship to the movie. I mean, especially a movie that's that old, it kind of brings you back into the moment. So it'd be super interesting to see somebody do that with a live jazz band and comics as well. So you will have the opportunity to do that in the very near future if you go check out the Wordless tour. So thank you so much to Art for taking the time to do that. Thanks to Jeff for helping set that one up. Thanks to Brian, as always, for editing the podcast together. Thanks to the Boing Boing Podcast Network. Thanks to you, the listener, for listening to this show. Hope you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, go rate us over on iTunes. You can also follow us on Tumblr. It's rylcast.tumblr.com. That's the first fastest, that's like the main vein to the show. You'll get that before you get it anywhere else over on the Tumblr. If you have any feedback, you can send us an email. It's rylcast.tumblr.com. That's about all the plugs I've got. So I've on my, I think, 4th or 5th interview of the last 2 weeks. I got one more tomorrow. So excited to bring all of these to you. Lots of really exciting episodes coming up. So stick around next week, and we will be back with another episode of RIYL.